This is the Resonant Identity, a podcast about personal growth, identity, and transformation. And I am your host, Terence Waters. If this show resonates with you, I invite you to share it with those that you care about and resonate with, and invite you to follow the show anywhere that you access your podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Spreaker, or anywhere you find your podcasts. I also ask that you consider leaving a review and feedback so that we can improve future episodes for you. A quick note just before we begin, AI did help generate this episode, and we personally reviewed and verified every part of it before publishing. At Fluxline, we believe in responsible, transparent AI usage and take full accountability for everything that we publish. You can learn more about our policy by visiting fluxline.pro/legal and accessing the option that says responsible AI usage. And keep in mind that the Resonant Identity is an educational and reflective framework and is not a clinical service. If you're navigating significant emotional distress or mental health concerns, please seek support from a qualified professional for all of your healthcare needs. The references for this episode come from my forthcoming book, The Resonance Core Framework, which will be published later this year in 2026. You can find all the information from our core value lesson 1, which it talks about embodied awareness relating to identity management, truth, distortion, emotional intelligence, the vast unknown of our minds, and so on. You can find information about this book and also information about the Resonance Core Framework in the show notes. So I want to go into this episode reflecting back on the various topics that we've discussed up to this point. We've gone through basically 6 episodes, really, thinking about what it means to be identity aligned, talking about truth and distortion, somatic regulation and the nervous system, how our mind lies to us, emotions that we're currently dealing with, and how we make valid choices. These all tied together under what's called a core value in the Resonance Core Framework, which we like to call embodied awareness. Now, I want to reflect on a lot of this because we've gone over a lot of information here and talked about many different psychological and philosophical references to helping us being sure that we align ourselves with who we want to become and our current identity, which is where a lot of this comes from. But in the Resonance Core Framework, like we've mentioned before, we use mythic technical knowledge and terms to describe many different pieces of information that are technical in nature. So instead of talking to you about like the window of tolerance or interoception or ways of regulating the nervous system, emotional intelligence, subconscious versus unconscious thoughts, right? We replace a lot of those terminology pieces with things that are much more relatable. The window of choice, the vast unknown of our mind, how to regulate our body, somatic cues, emotional intelligence, emotions, things like that. Because while we definitely respect the work that all of our technical teams, our scientists, our psychologists, and very strong thinkers have done for us, for the rest of us, it can be really difficult trying to hold on to all that information. And so what we do in the Resonance Core Framework and the Resonant Identity is we take all of those pieces of terminology and make them in mythic technical terms, which it essentially just translates into what we call story. But we then want to roll them all up into one theme, which we call a core value. Based on everything we've talked about over these last 6 episodes, we can now roll them up into one core value, which is called embodied awareness, which encompasses all of it. How you remain aware and present in what is happening within yourself. This is relating to the self, your own ways of how you react to and respond to situations, and the decisions that you make based on that alignment. So when we talk about embodied awareness, that's specifically what we're talking about, is ensuring that we are as much as possible present and aware for what's actually happening here. Now, I'll also be honest here. Initially, I was actually going to go into the next module, talking about value systems, drives, how to actually embody your actual identity through actions and things like that. But I felt that it would be a disservice to really not being able to describe why we call them core values, because as we start moving forward, I realize I use that as terminology as well. And these are RCF specific terms. What I mean by that is when I talk about a core value, that is something the Resonance Core Framework summarizes all of the things that we just talked about before. So when I talk about embodied awareness, that's what I mean. Interoception, body regulation, being aware of your cues, understanding your thoughts, your judgments, recognizing when to respond and how to respond according to the window of choice. That all rolls into that one term, embodied awareness. And the thing is, what they also don't tell you, because this whole entire podcast is really based on my dissertation that will happen in a couple of years. This is a lot of work that I have done in a lot of research, understanding from my book, ways that I have lived my life and being able to observe others' behavior and systemic architecture, and how humans are at the center of all of it. Because if you really think about it, humans are why we have our interactions one with another. We're able to have conscious thoughts. We're able to feel things and understand what those feelings might mean. We're able to be conscious and aware of what's happening around us and within us. And really, we're at the forefront of everything that happens in this world, based on the different ways that we impact ourselves and others. But what they don't tell you when you're actually studying for a PhD, especially when you're writing such a big framework that what I'm writing is it actually then starts to unfold in ways that you really don't tend to expect. And in my case, what's been happening is I've been starting to see patterns as I start to interact with other people and seeing things in myself that I can talk about all these things all day long, but what about some examples? What about some ways that we may be able to explain, is this actually valid? What does it all mean? Why are we talking about all this crazy stuff? And what is in it for me, which is a big part of it too. And I'm sure that's been kind of a question that's been looming on your mind for a while. And so even though I had today with the full understanding that I was going to talk about values, I actually now want to give you some personal anecdotes about embodied awareness instead, because I would be doing you a disservice as the listener in being able to be a little bit more personal and actually showing you how I live embodied awareness every day. And the funny part is I got a lot of experience in it over this weekend and over the past several weeks. So what we're going to be doing this episode is we're just going to recognize what embodied awareness is, which I've already talked about, which is all the things we've talked about before. And I'm going to give you some personal anecdotes about how to apply it, specifically from examples of my own life. Now, I do this also in my book, in the Resonance Core Framework. So when that comes out a little bit later this year, you'll start to see some of those start to appear, because I like to relate to people. I don't want to just simply give people a whole bunch of terms and try to hope that somehow you're able to hold on to all of it and you're going to make sense of it all. It's going to be difficult, especially now, because we're trying to figure out, well, how do I apply it to myself? So I'm hoping that these examples might be able to give you some insight, some ways that you may be able to see, I see how this actually works. So in a couple of episodes earlier, I did talk about having to face a very strong issue with my cat, wondering what I was going to do in terms of his physical and mental health. He was experiencing trouble with breathing. He was having trouble eating. The only thing that I could actually feed him at a certain point was milk. And that was a chore for him because he was having such a hard time breathing. Not to get too far into it, but a massive tumor was likely the cause in his actual nasal cavity, which was preventing him from being able to actually breathe, and at a certain point, inevitably would likely take his life. You can imagine the emotions, the somatic tightening, the thoughts of whirlwinds that were going through my mind, trying to see if there were other things that I should do for him, being okay with saying, what is it that I actually need to do? Is this something that I am actually morally okay with in terms of euthanizing potentially a life? And I do have to sadly report that, yes, that's actually that step that I had to take. Not from a place of hoping things would get better, but from understanding what my alignment would look like if I were in the same situation as him. Because I experienced things like chest tightening. I experienced a lot of sadness that day. I grieved probably for a good week. I was dealing with a lot of stress. I was dealing with a lot of what ifs, grief, even blaming myself, wondering if there were other things I could have done. But what I ended up landing on, understanding the past versus the current experiences, I first understood that my body was just simply bracing itself for a potential for a lot of hurt. The somatics were already in place because I felt some bracing and jaw tightening. My emotions would start running just out of waves. And I just recognized that's what they are, even up until the point where the actual maneuver occurred. And my mind was really trying to understand from a logical standpoint, Am I actually okay with the potential that I could be taking a human life? Let's call it an animal life, but I think they're humans. Let's be honest. Our furry friends are humans. I don't care what anyone says. In the end, I had to look at it from an actual identity alignment case. If I were in my cat situation, what would I want my human to do? And the truth is, I would want him to let me go because I knew it would be my time. And when I started to see the suffering that he was going through that last week, I realized more and more that that was the right response. And luckily, I had some very wonderful doctors and vets next to me, some technicians who really walked me through the process. And they even gave me a hug and allowed me to just be with my cat in those last few moments. It hurt, but I also was strong. I was happy to see him looking out the window and just being calm and joyous in what he was doing. It was a good, peaceful experience in the end, because that's what I ended up feeling once it was all done, was peace and acceptance. Sure, the emotions hit. Sure, the chest tightening still comes up every now and then. But that peaceful moment really showed me the true alignment of what actually happened when I did let my cat go that day. That alignment occurred because I was acknowledging what my body was doing, the emotions that I was feeling, and the thoughts that were constantly going through my head, not fighting them, not turning them away, allowing myself to feel them in their true form. And this is something that a lot of people have a hard time doing because emotions are not fun, especially when they involve trauma, especially when they involve hurt, grief, sadness, and so on. But the fact of the matter is, as we've been talking this whole entire time, cues are just data points. Narratives are just data points. When I recognize them for what they are, which was my body and my mind trying to grieve the loss of someone I truly love, I recognize that's what they were. And why would I deny myself the ability to feel those emotions and understand what my body needed rather than simply succumbing and trying to suppress it all? Why would anyone do that? The answer is you should not. Because I was then able to take that and grow from it. Sure, I'll feel the grief. Sure, I'll feel the emotions. Sure, I will need to pause and sometimes cry. I admit it. That's who I am. That's just what I do. Hold my emotions on my sleeve. But to deny myself the ability to actually grieve the loss of someone that I have truly cared about for 6+ years, he helped me through the pandemic. He helped me in so many different ways when I felt alone in this world. It was only necessary for me to being able to show that back in strength in holding his paw in those last moments. That's what embodied awareness is. True, unfiltered, interoception, grounding, presence, and vulnerability. Unfiltered, unscripted, allowing it to happen. When those moments of emotions occur, why are we fighting it? When those moments of constant whirlwind of thoughts coming in, why are we suppressing those thoughts? Why are we constantly telling ourselves that we should not experience human life? The truth is, we need those moments in life because it's the only way that we are able to balance what is happening today and in the future. And let me be honest with you, it's not easy. It's just not. It takes practice. It takes time. It takes grounding, but it also takes acceptance, which is the biggest thing there. It is okay to feel things. It is okay to think things. It is okay to acknowledge all of the feelings that occur within you. But it is your obligation and responsibility to take all those data points and make sure that you're making actions that truly align with who you are, what you stand for, aligned in your identity and resonance. You're listening to The Resonant Identity with your host, Terence Waters. We'll be right back. You're listening to The Resonant Identity with your host, Terence Waters, and welcome back. So thanks for bearing with me, by the way, before the break. I know that's probably a little heavy. Breathe for me for just a little bit, because I know I gave you something that was probably not the easiest thing to have to hear. And the reason I say that is because we're about to go even a little bit deeper. Welcome to the world of trauma, ladies and gentlemen, because this is what we do. This is how we experience trauma in all of our own facets. Everyone has their own situations and everyone has their own stories to tell. These just happen to be mine. The next example I want to go over regarding embodied awareness is my bipolar disorder. So let's add even more to the fun. Now, before we go any further, of course, I need to basically mention I am only speaking on this one from my personal experience. I am not giving medical advice, especially when it comes down to mental health issues. If you are experiencing trauma, issues with mental health, depression, PTSD, anything specifically that requires medical assistance and professionalism, go get it. Please do not let me be a person to tell you how to live your life. That said, I can tell you what my personal experience has been, which I call my creative truth, in dealing with bipolar disorder. Because the more that I live my life, the more that I start to see what happens in my life and the ways that I respond, it surprises me how so much I have regulated my system from that period of knowing up until now. So I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder after being required to go specifically to a mental health professional by work. I was being called out for being very obnoxious, for being very outspoken, reacting, not even aware of my emotions or my actual reactions or the way that I was acting or even my behavior. What I thought was normal behavior actually turned out to be a big, big other problem, which, as my therapist then told me, we're going to refer you to a psychiatrist. You have an issue here. Because when he took me in, because this is literally the first time I had ever been to any type of mental health professional, almost 10 years ago to the date, which is kind of funny. He showed me the answers that I gave to one of the specific intake forms, and I had said 12 out of 13 of those were correct. Not even realizing I was just filling out forms, just for whatever felt right. I then saw a psychiatrist literally a week later because that's how severe it was. And sure enough, I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Now, here's the crazy part about that, because I have always somewhat known a little bit about reactions and reactivity, but I also did not really realize that I was doing this myself. Because here's the thing, and here's the best way that I can explain it. First off, to be told that the actions and the behavior that you are doing are somehow not acceptable by society and need regulation and help, to be told that in my mid-30s, and to look at life and realize this is how I've always lived life. This is me. What does that even mean? To all of a sudden be told that I am this person that really needs to regulate how I actually respond was asinine to me. That sounded like one of the most ludicrous, stupid things I've ever heard in my lifetime. And then on top of that, being actually told, hey, these are ways that you need to regulate your body, and here's how you actually need to handle it, which is responsive, being aware of situations, it made no sense to me. And so what I ended up having to do, and my psychiatrist was the one who suggested it, was to take a mood journal. Any time that I would actually experience any type of emotion, didn't matter what it was, write it down. Every single emotion that ever happened, anytime I became aware of it. In my first day of doing this, again, trying to pass it off, thinking that it was just absolute asinine work, I had logged 138 emotions in a 12-hour period of time. The next day, I had logged 118 emotions day after day, and so on. And I kept doing it, not understanding what I was doing, only saying I'm just marking emotions, because I was seeing my psychiatrist the next week. And I showed her my mood journal, and she's like, this is exactly what I'm talking about. All of these things, you felt these emotions, and did you happen to respond or react to any of them? And I said, probably about 75% of them. She's like, that's exactly what we're talking about here. Your reactions are so far gone that there's no way that you can bring about a cohesive person. Something to those regard or those words, right? And I'm thinking to myself, oh gosh, because if my work is telling me that I have to do this or I'm going to lose my job, I now need to figure out what that actually means in terms of how do I take this information and become this person that's actually supposed to respond appropriately. I had no idea what I was doing. It didn't make sense to me. And so what I then had to do was, over several years, this was not a simple night and day process. I really had to be cognizant of every single thing I was feeling, writing down notes of what was happening, and forcing myself to listen to everything that was going on. I told my supervisor specifically, I'm not going to respond in meetings unless I absolutely have to. I'm not going to say anything. I'm just simply regulating my system. And luckily, she was very, very understanding of a lot of this. So we were able to work through it together. Fast forward almost 10 years from now, And I'm now writing a book that literally talks about this exact same thing of somatic awareness. Somatic awareness, being understanding and aware of your emotions, and understanding how to appropriately respond to situations that occur. Because what was happening here is that I was just simply managing symptoms by responding and reacting however I wanted, without really truly understanding what was happening. Because emotions were the only way that I could respond to something, because I was so much in a defensive mode that nothing else made sense. But in order for me to being able to take that, I then had to apply embodied awareness and its processes in order to be able to understand what it means to hold emotions, what it means to have tension, what it means when your narratives just start flying off the walls, especially for me, because I was also diagnosed with anxiety disorder as well. So I had to deal with a lot of that too. But the cool part about it that I realized in every point is that the world does not ask me to respond or react to every single situation that I have, only the ones that actually matter to me. And that's a big deal, because as soon as I was able to take that knowledge and also recognize that I need to change into this what's called normal me, whatever that meant, of course, right? I was then able to actually pause, take notes on what people were saying. And then from there, I was able to actually understand some of the flawed pieces. So like when I was in meetings, I then was able to say, well, I see that you're saying this, but wouldn't it make more sense if we did this, 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 and this because of this? And it all of a sudden changed the dynamic so much, because it was almost like every single person in the room just looked at me and said, yeah, why wouldn't we do that? I said, well, that makes sense to me based on what it is you're saying here, because X, Y, and Z. That is the process of causal reality versus volition. What I decided to do was listen in meetings and just take notes. And I did that for several weeks. My head was down. I was just taking some notes on my notepad, writing some things on my laptop, and just listening. But the thing is, I was able to go over those notes and understand terminology and nuance that I had not been aware of before. And eventually what ended up happening was I then was able to come prepared to meetings with actual logical information, because I was using the information people were saying as data, not as a deterrent, not as an attack, just simply data. What made sense? And from there, I then was able to define, well, I want to contribute in this case, but I will do it very targeted and very strategic, so that way I ensure that I'm speaking from a place of identity, not from a place of reactivity. That is the volition stage of the window of choice. When you take that time of just a couple of seconds to instead stop all of the cues, but to be aware that they're there, and then just kind of listen and ask for a little bit more clarifying detail. The three words that I love using in a lot of this case are the words "tell me more." Because if you want someone else to being able to tell you a little bit more detail, that gives you the ability to actually research and understand nuance that you may not have been aware of before. And in the process of doing so, you expand your window of choice, because you then realize that there are other decisions you can make that aren't available to you. Let's take another example. Me, I loved doing the overthinking and the overthinking of the overthinking and constant back and forth to where I just could not function. Anxiety does this to me so much because I'm the person that likes to be on the cutting edge. I'm very futuristic. I'm a person that loves to being able to be ahead of the game, showing people that I can actually make a difference by all of the ideas and the creativity that I have. And I have that. I already know that. That's one of my strongest suits. But when I don't have the ability of actually being able to contribute something, then I was starting to worry if I wasn't doing enough, what I could have done better. What if I would have said this? What if I would have said that? And the problem was, because I did not have a regulated body and system, those thoughts constantly came about so fast and then started to spiral on themselves. Because then I started realizing I was being anxious, and then I tried to stop myself from being anxious. And for those of you who happen to be overthinkers, you know that that is a spiral. And I was experiencing panic attacks. I would shut down. I would never know what to say in any situation, because I was just dealing with so much problem, so much input, that I didn't know what to do with it. So with that situation in mind, and I tried anxiety meds, they only just made it worse for me. But what happened to me was I instead just finally just decided to say literally out loud, stop, which we call the stop method. I talk about it a little bit later in my book, but essentially When you realize that you're spiraling, literally say the word out loud and put your hand out as if you're trying to stop someone. And you literally yell it, stop. It stops everything in its tracks. Everything. Because then it says, wait a minute, why did you do that? So that way you can give yourself some time to breathe, to slow down, to being able to say, you're not pushing away what's happening, but you need to stop the record from playing just a little bit. Because then what happens is, inevitably, they will start coming back up, but you then have the ability of saying, why am I thinking this? What am I thinking? What is actually happening right now? The stop method is one of the best ways that I've found to just slow the roll of whatever the brain or the somatic cues or the emotions are trying to do. Because they're intense when they start to hit. And they always feel real because they are attached to our past experience. But my experience has been when I experience those bipolar rolls, when I'm in my lowest of low, when in my highest of high, when my anxiety is running out of control. The stop method has really been given me that power to just say, wait a minute, stop the roll for a second. What's going on here? Not stopping it in means of trying to avoid it, stopping it just so that you can catch your breath for just a couple seconds and then allow yourself to go through interpretive hygiene and re-establish embodied awareness and presence through grounding, through breathing, and those techniques. Because then those thoughts, the lows, the highs, the thoughts, the anxiety, the emotional cues, then become data points. They're in no way indicative of who you are. It's just simply what your body is doing, as we've talked many episodes before. But if you could stop it for just a moment so you can regain your grounding and your footing with just some slow boxed breathing. I like to touch my face and touch some surfaces to reground myself. I sometimes will take a walk, and if it becomes too much, I'll even just remove myself from the situation. Whatever it takes to ensure that you are grounded. Because you can then come back to it and approach it from a data-driven decision-making lens. What is happening? Why might I be experiencing these thoughts? Why am I experiencing chest tightening? Why does this fear feel so real? What is going on here? Because then you can start to actually unwind those cues and bring yourself into a term of freedom from them. You're listening to The Resonant Identity with your host, Terence Waters. We will be right back. Now, the final thing that I'm going to be going over from my own personal life is actually what to do in those situations in real time. Because today's episode actually came from my ability of being able to allow myself to feel calm again. Yes, I've been regulating myself and being aware of my situations, my bipolar disorder and so on over several years, but it's only been up until recently that I've been allowing myself the ability to let go, to actually remain calm, to allow the parasympathetic nervous system to remain at the forefront of what my body should be doing by kicking those monkeys off of the other side of the seesaw. But what they don't tell you is that when you start doing that, you literally give your body a sense of fresh air because the body regulation all of a sudden is able to let go of all of that bracing, that tension, that fear that has been bottled up in you. And in my case, it's been bottled up for several years. And it becomes so strong that you almost want to fall asleep for a couple of hours. That's what's been happening to me recently. As I've been learning more and more to regulate my body, recognizing that I don't have to be in a constant threat, fight, or flight response, the body then starts seeing it as its own problem because then it realizes, wait a minute, I'm actually able to be calm? This is weird. You can let it all go now. And even with that come their own emotional cues, by the way, which is even more interesting. And it's something I've had to recognize because the nervous system braces itself. It does this because of the fight or flight response. And if it does this over several years of time, particularly around trauma, childhood issues, not feeling safe or whatever, when you're finally letting go of all of that, your brain and your body all of a sudden let out this long period of release. And it actually feels freeing, but you feel exhausted, even sometimes crying at the same time. I've been feeling tearful, sadness, and grief every time I do this because I've been working on my body in trying to release some of the tension, especially on my left side. I've noticed that I've experienced a lot of tension in my upper thigh on my left side and my obliques, My hip has been very, very tightened. And so I'm trying my best to release all of that over several weeks. And this is what has been the result. And so that becomes tricky because as the PSNS activation occurs, it then purges all of that emotional backlog. And it just becomes so incredibly intense that sometimes it will literally take you out of the game for a little while, especially as you start learning how to do interoception, how to regulate your body and your mind. The important thing to understand with this one is that even learning how to remain calm and how to be restful is in and of itself something you should accept. And I've had to do that today, actually, of all days. It's so easy for me on a Monday to just want to jump right back into the fray, doing all sorts of different types of work, trying to catch up on the backlog of work that I have to do, reading up on my PhD, working with some of my clients. But when I realized today that today was the day I needed to pause, instead, I actually was able to be more inspired to record this episode because I wanted to share it directly with you, explaining what embodied awareness looks like. Even on the opposite end, which is feeling calm, centered, and true to yourself. Because what you'll find in many cases, especially for many of us who are workaholics, who like to perform, who take pride in our work and so on, that we need to give ourselves permission to also let go, to be okay with having a work-life balance and recognizing we don't have to work 10 plus hours every single day. Why can't a 40-hour work week be enough? Why do we have to constantly feel like we need to put in 60 or 70 plus hour work for the same amount of pay? The answer is you're still going to get the same paycheck every single 2 weeks anyway, right? So why put in that extra effort? Why? The answer is there's no reason to. The only thing that it's doing is hurting yourself. And that's the truth of what happens when you decide to take upon balance in everything you do. Regulating your body, meditating, taking time for yourself for self-care, emotions, ensuring that you go to the gym, eating right, being with your family, being with your friends, doing some fun leisure activities, balance, ensuring that you are not just simply being a workhorse the rest of your life, because it will literally detriment you, because you're not going to be able to experience life the way that you want to. And as we get further in the resonant identity, you're going to start to realize that you're going to have to give up some of those things in order to be able to transform into who you want to become. Because work is not just the only thing. It's also leisure. It's also regulation. And it's also recognizing what does fit and what does not, which we'll be going over in future episodes. So when we talk about embodied awareness, we need to understand that it is the bridge between emotion, cues, narratives, and identity. When we talk about all of those things like emotional cueing, interoception, the window of choice, the vast unknown, embodied awareness is literally the core value in the Resonance Core framework that embodies and brings it all together as one thing. We want to practice embodied awareness every day. How we regulate ourselves, how we ensure that we do not let the reactions take over our decision making, how we ensure that we are aligned with the right things, and also ensuring that we don't get hooked on the wrong things. Recognizing when we experience resonance, recognizing when we experience distortion and dissonance. All of those things are internal aspects. No one around you will ever know any of these things. This is everything that involves just you. You're everything from just your somatic bracing and your emotional system, all the way up into your thoughts and how you believe your identity to be. Because no one can define any of that for you. And no one can also regulate any of that for you. You have to do that. That is your responsibility as a steward of the resonant identity. Because then, once we get into future episodes, embodied awareness is then how you are able to establish what your identity is, which includes things like your value virtue system, how you take on making decisions every single day, how you embody your value virtue system, while also remaining aligned in your emotional, somatical, and narrative cues, and how you're able to notice when you feel dysregulated, when your internal state is less than par, when you know that you need to actually take a step back and maybe heal, rather than simply engage in every single situation you've been experiencing. That's what embodied awareness does for you. It is always the first step, because identity alignment, we can pretend to be so all the time. But if it does not come from an alignment within ourselves, eventually erodes and doesn't become important anymore. Because as we know, our body and our mind like to hold on to the past experience of who it thinks we are, our past identity, which is no way indicative of who you are today. And because of autopilot, and because it's much easier to be that person, by the way, if you're not actively taking steps to rewrite the script of your actual vast unknown, it won't change. Your identity will remain the same as who you have been, not who you are and who you want to become. And in order to define what you stand for, which is your value virtue system, you also have to have an identity aligned system in somatic, emotional, and narrative cues all the way through. Because once you're resolved in resonance and you know what it is that you want to become, you then need to define it in what you stand for. And to do that, you have to have that foundation of identity first. There is no other way. So when we talk about embodied awareness, it's ensuring that we ourselves are regulated enough and aligned in who we are by watching ourselves, our state, our emotions, how we respond, how we make choices, all of those things to ensure that they show an identity coherent self. So that when we start to define why we stand up for what we do and what we believe in, it makes sense because our identity supports it. You're listening to The Resonant Identity with your host, Terence Waters. We'll be right back. You're listening to The Resonant Identity with your host, Terence Waters. Welcome back. So now what we're going to do is take all of this information and integrate it and begin to close the episode. Because embodied awareness is really where it all comes together and how it all starts. Your identity, who you're becoming, who you want to become, who you are, and how you'll be able to stand up for what you want to believe in. And I did that with my case by understanding myself first, recognizing that my bipolar disorder, as an example, is not a limiting factor. It just simply is a part of me that needed to be regulated. And that just comes down to understanding cues. That comes down to understanding our patterns, what our brains and our minds and our emotions like to tell us in those moments when we're starting to experience a contracted window of choice. It's just embodied awareness. Because you are in no way indicative of your cues. I am not bipolar. Instead, I experience bipolar disorder. Bipolar disorder doesn't define who I am. It's just a part of me. And nothing really defines everything of who they are. They're just bits and pieces. Only you can define what your identity is. But it's embodied awareness that allows us to being able to take and understand those parts of us that may contract our window of choice, that may cause us to make decisions outside of who we are. And the thing is, that's how it brings about the value virtue system, like I mentioned before. Because now I can look into it, and this will preview the next episode. What are those different qualities of life that I really do believe in? Why do I believe in those things? What makes them stand out to me? What exactly resonates in terms of my own experience and internal self when I think about my values? And then once I have my values defined, well, what does that look like in how I actually embody them, which we call virtues? So when I think about, for example, creativity, what things can I do or topics that I enjoy that embody creativity? Because in order for us to be able to understand our value system, we also have to first understand ourselves. We also have to understand what aligns with us, truly aligns with us, and leave behind what doesn't. Because what we'll find out in the next episode is that many of our values are borrowed. They're usually from other situations of life that in no way actually define who we are anymore. That's a hard thing to hear, and just know that we will be going through some practices to go over that. But just be aware that our value system really needs to be looked at from a very, very root-based process. A view of saying, I'm willing to let go of everything that I think I stand for and starting anew. Because what you'll find is once you actually do this on your own, there's going to be many, many values that you're going to write down that you realize actually are just simply there because you wrote them down, not because you actually resonate with them. So be prepared for that as we go into that episode. Also, since we are in an interlude episode here, that's what this one happens to be, I do ask you to please ensure that you have defined your identity in terms of who you are and what you stand for. Because this is the framework that is necessary and the foundation you need to have before we can go into the value virtue system. Because without that identity defined, everything else erodes. Eventually, your value virtue system will be there on paper, but it won't align with you because it also doesn't really define who you are. That's the tricky part here, is that identity also doesn't necessarily mean that we write it down once and we forget about it. Identity is constantly evolving. We find out new things about ourselves. We rewrite the script of our vast unknown. We start to experience insight about ourselves of things we just weren't even aware of before. But that's the beauty of life, is that you then get to actually rewrite your script in what you believe in, not anyone else. Because you are at the center of the resonant identity and the resonance core framework. You're the architect. I'm just here giving you information. I can't write your script. I have no idea who the hell you are. Only you do. No one else does either. They may have an idea of who they think you are, but only you know who you are. And in order to be able to make this next episode work, you need to ensure that you do that identity. Ensure that you look into the website, the past experiences, the past episodes, Fluxline's website, which has all of the identity challenges. You can go over them there. And when you're ready, jump into this next section with a new understanding of who you are and what you want to stand for, because it's literally going to transform your life the more you do this. So in closing, what I'll just simply say here is this. Embodied awareness is a full process core value that takes in interoception, identity alignment, and resonance, and helps you define who you are. It also ensures that you are regulated enough and aware of yourself in a way that ensures that you are making decisions in line with that identity that you have defined. This is just simply a pause episode, and through embodied awareness that you will practice every day, you'll be able to see that you are more calm, more collected, more aware of your surroundings, and able to distinguish between truth and distortion much easier. Ensure that you are looking for those data points, not jumping to conclusions until you have all the information that you need to make a decision. And even if it means that you just simply don't do any decision at all, you just simply are writing down information because you need that time, you have made strides in your embodied awareness. Because it's better to not do something than to actually try to do something that is 100% against who you are. It also, however, though, on the flip side, is important that you do make decisions in line with who you are, rather than just simply watching your life fly by, which means you need to be a person that causes action, that works to make decisions so that you transform. All of these things that I have talked to you about with my personal experience has shown you some ways of how you might be able to ground yourself and practice embodied awareness, how to be able to recognize and respond to and regulate your body and your mind to ensure that you are always in that present state. Because the more that you do this, it naturally just becomes your natural state. You usually then find you don't have to regulate as much anymore, because all you really had to do was just practice and recognize what matters and leave behind what doesn't. And that's the beauty of the identity. When you know who you are and what you stand for, regulation naturally comes because you make decisions in line with it. And eventually, once we add the next step in our next lessons, you then understand what you stand for, so you can make decisions proudly and not worry about what other people think about you. Thanks again for listening to my episode today. If this episode resonated with you, I invite you to subscribe, review, and like this on your favorite podcast service, and share it out with those people that you care about and resonate with. You can find the Resonant Identity on Spreaker, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us on Instagram, Facebook, Blue Sky, or X under the term The Resonant ID. You can also access our website. You can find that at theresonantidentity.com. Have fun, be safe, know who you are and what you stand for, and make choices aligned with your true and chosen identity. Stay safe out there. Goodbye now.